So we're excited to introduce our next speaker, Elia Marsal, who will take us on a journey. Her talk is focusing on the developments in our field of the past 30 years. Elia Marsal is a lecturer at University College London's Department of History of Art and a researcher at the Institute of Contemporary History, Nova University in Lisbon. She worked as a fellow in contemporary art conservation and research within the project Reshaping the Collectible, when artworks live in the museum at Tate from 2018 to 20. So please, Elia, stage is yours.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. And I would like to start by thanking the organizing committee for the invitation. This is a wonderful initiative, and I very much look forward to learn with everyone, participants, panelists, everyone that is involved in this conference in the next 2 days. I will also start by saying that indeed my presentation hopes at looking at the development of the field of conservation in the last 30 or so years, but I would like us to have some leeway when we discuss these timelines and these chronologies, because indeed, as I will argue in the next 14 minutes, the chronology of contemporary art conservation, it's not different from the chronology of the conservation field at large. So I tried to do a tentative chronology, trying to understand what are the trends of the discipline and how they have evolved in the last 70 years now. And indeed, what we see is that although the development of conservation of contemporary art as a practice and as a discipline has emerged roughly in the 90s, it comes from a bigger tradition that looks into other ways of doing beyond the approach to scientific conservation on the one hand, and on the other hand, beyond our typical or canonized understandings of materials and materiality. So what I hope I will argue is that although in conservation of contemporary art, we do see a paradigm shift in terms of theory, practice, and ethics, that is not a paradigm shift that it's limited to contemporary art as a subject, but it's a paradigm shift throughout the field, that it's part of many factors, of which changes of an artistic practice are only one of them. And I also think that looking at the last years with pandemic, rising levels of social inequality, climate change, issues with identity, and finally the understanding of the multiplicity of identities and ways of being as being part of our core ways of being, we will witness more and more paradigm shifts, more changes in the social fabric that will undoubtedly impact conservation as a profession. So these are all related to each other. But today I will focus specifically on changes in the artistic practice. And what we see with contemporary art is that there was a set of initial conditions that led to the development of this new specialization that interests everyone in this conference so much. And there are initial conditions that were developed by the conservation field in the 90s. We see here as an example some conferences that were part of this ecology, specifically in Europe and in North America, which are the contexts that I'll be situating this discussion today. And we also see that these conferences come from a historical drag of reflections, of projects, of various understandings of the needs of these new objects that are entering museum collections, and some of them were already part of museum collections for some time now. So what we see is that many of these early initiatives in conservation of contemporary arts as a field, if we want to circumscribe it as such at this time, were indeed concerned with preservation of what we call modern materials. However, what we also see is that there are lineages that are intertwined in the definition of these initial conditions. And the broadcast industry also was looking at the issues that were emerging from their own practice. So while we see that early approaches to the preservation of media arts focused sometimes on the material challenges presented by film and tape, we also see a big interest in the preservation of video instigated by broadcast and distribution industries. One example is, of course, the Media Alliance, which hosted the first symposium on video preservation at the MoMA in 1991. We also have the Playback 1996 conference that was hosted by the Bay Area Video Coalition, and of which the preprints are still online, at least the last time I checked, and they are amazing because they really give us a notion of what was already perceived to be the challenges of the field at that time. We also see a conference in the Kunstmuseum in Wolfsburg, how durable is video art? And again, these are just a couple of examples that demonstrate how the initial conditions of conservation cannot be just restricted to what we could consider to be the field at the time. And we also see initiatives that emerged in the 90s that were highly influential. For example, we had the artist documentation program that was set up by Carol Mancusi-Ungaro, and aimed at collecting the voices of artists and their perception about the preservation of the work. And we have many other important initiatives in the United States, for example, with the creation of the Electronic Media Group in 1997 by the American Institute of Conservation, and the foundation of the Independent Media Arts Program by Mona Jimenez and the Media Alliance by the end of this decade. So indeed, if we could characterize the emergence of the field, or like the initial material conditions that led to this emergence, in a very simplified way, we could see parallel roots and lineages from the broadcast and distribution industries, and conservation specifically situated in museums, and in some cases also in archives, that were entangling with each other. However, these initial conditions led to what we could consider a massive expansion. And in the first decade of the new millennium, we saw several projects, several conferences emerging, looking at the different ways of doing conservation of contemporary art. There are a couple of projects that, of course, are pioneering projects, but without wanting to exclude any, I would like to just mention a few. For example, the Variable Media Network. We also have other, specifically, for example, the Active Archive that started in 2000 as a collaboration between the Bern University of Arts and the Swiss Institute for Art Research, Capturing Unstable Media, promoted by the V2 in Rotterdam. But again, these are just few examples in a whole field of practice that was emerging with their own funding models, that sometimes associated to universities, sometimes associated to museums and other cultural industries. And that led to what we could call the consolidation of this field after 2010, with new practices and workflows being developed to sustainably adhere to some standards and to some forms of practices of care for time-based media conservation. So this whole context led to some specific considerations that could be seen as overarching to the needs of the field, like the need to manage information or support ongoing professional development in the use of digital preservation tools, and also the need to recognize the infrastructures of care that work across and beyond the institution. And one of the first project results to specifically look into this and to, at least to my knowledge, to state it that clearly, came from the project Collecting the Performative, a research network examining emerging practice for collecting and conserving performance-based art, that came from a collaboration between art institutions, the Tate and the Van Haben Museum, and academia through Maastricht University. These, of course, resulted also in a practical tool for the conservation of a new form of practice for museums, at least, which was performance art, which was the live list. And in the meantime, we've seen many developments in the conservation of performance, but also in conservation of other formats that were emerging in the millennium, in the beginning of the new millennium, but are still emerging in the ways they are shifting their own conditions. So now what we could consider the conservation of contemporary art field becomes an amalgamation, an assemblage of different practices that are not mutually exclusive, on the one hand, and on the other hand, are entangled in a way that one could truly consider interdisciplinary. So right now, it is very hard sometimes to understand what are the skills that time-based media and contemporary art conservators need, because the context is always changing. We're looking at the need of, as Joanna Phillips says, being long-time learners, being flexible, understanding methodologies and the decision-making, as also Martina and Martina mentioned before. What we could say, indeed, is that besides these shifts in theory, and also in the way that we recognize and understand and care for objects, the contemporary art conservation field has become more and more complex as we are starting to bring in new forms of practice, but also new theoretical and ethical considerations about what objects are and how we can care for them. This made me remember Ilya Prigiunini and Isabel Stranger's book, Order of Chaos, where they talk about how physical systems that sometimes are a bit far from the equilibrium at some point develop some form of self-organizing structures that are very similar that one could find, for example, in biological systems. And bear with me, this sounds a bit off topic, but indeed I think that similar trends can be seen now with conservation of contemporary art, with where we see which as time goes by and we accrue experience and we work through these forms of complexity, structures that are very far from the equilibrium are starting to get their own self-organization through this community of practice that it's being created through these research projects that are both looking into theory, ethics, and practice, and also looking at these infrastructures of knowledge of the museum. And we can see that through the workflow, to the development of workflows for acquisition of complex digital objects or performance or objects that are complex in all their forms. And also we can see that through the established methodologies for research and their inherent criticality that was built through years of navigating these free flow energetic paradoxes. And again, we also see that through new forms of research. And I would like to finish with three aspects that I do feel will be part of the future understanding of conservation. One of them has to do with the categorization, and this is an excerpt of a performance by Kemang Walalohere that works a bit as a sculpture and as a performance at the same time. And these sculptures are unique. So one of the aspects that we need to consider is how to move from these categorizations that are very useful for the structure of the museum, but might not fit so well how the objects behave. Other aspect that we need to consider, and this is an artwork that I always bring because it's from one of my favorite artists, it's the obsolescence of practice and how we will consider the conservation within the social. And finally, we also need to consider for whom we are conserving objects and how difference and how multiplicity can be part of our conservation strategies and our forms for caring for those objects. And that's it. Thank you so much for hearing me.